Good morning. I want to thank everybody for being here today, and as well thank for all those who are watching live from doeenergy.gov live for this session today. It's in a very important session as we look at our emergency response activities in preparation for the hurricane season. And I'm really excited for the dialogue that you should have today, as well as the interactions and the communications. One of the things that we all know is getting to know people ahead of time is extremely important, and there's always a couple new faces in the crowd, so it's important for everybody to get to know each other so that we can have the dialogues and the discussions before the hurricane season starts and not during. I'd like to thank all our industry partners here today, the state officials that are here today, as well as our interagency colleagues. We know that it's a whole government approach as we look at hurricane season. Energy issues are always a part of the mix somewhere. And so part of our activity is to make sure that we're supporting the restoration process and that we're very efficient in how we provide information to the states and the federal government community because we want a very effective restoration process. So I want to thank everybody here today. I'd like to also thank our departmental colleagues within DOE. We are trying to make this a departmental-wide effort as we move forward and we look at emergency response events. We know not all our events are just hurricanes. We have to deal with oil issues and other issues, propane, and so we want to make sure that we're engaging all aspects of the Department of Energy. The climate is continuing to change, and I think we need to continue to focus on how we can take a look at some of the lessons learned but modernize our infrastructure. Our energy infrastructure is a core component to the economy and society, and we want to continue to adapt to some of those climate issues. During every energy emergency, there's always some lessons learned. We were talking briefly before this session began of how every event is a teachable moment. And I hope we can take some of those experiences as teachable moments and move forward and take some of those lessons learned as we continue to evolve. My name is Patricia Hoffman. I'm the Assistant Secretary for the Office of I always get that, Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. It's a long title. And we are a core component of ESF 12 for the Department of Energy. And part of our activities will be to help facilitate collaboration across the department and looking at emergency response activities specific to ESF 12, Energy Support Function 12. We continue to support a team of responders throughout the department, as well as within our organizations in support of FEMA and the other interagencies during disasters. So as we get started, I'd like to just thank the staff for pulling this meeting together today. I'd like to thank Ben Steinberg, Jeff Baumgardner, Miriam Posner, and Misty Morris for all their hard work. It took a lot of time and effort to pull together the panels that you will have here this morning, as well as the tabletop exercise that we plan to do later on today. I look for an encouraging discussion, bringing out the issues, some of the lessons learned, and how we can gain more experience from all the talent and capabilities that are here today. So with that, I'd like to introduce the MC for the effort today. Dr. Kevin O'Prey is the founder, co-founder, and chairman and president of Obsidian Analysis Incorporated, a professional service firm providing analytical and policy consulting for Homeland Security, national security, and intelligence decision makers. He's done numerous exercises and events throughout the federal government with respect to emergency response activities. He's worked in an all-hazards environment and looking at lessons learned and how to improve the coordination and cooperation. And so I'm so pleased to have him here today. So with that, Kevin O'Prey. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to OE and all our partners for joining us today on obviously a very important event in ClearPath 2, getting ready for the coming hurricane season. If you have in front of you your agendas, I'll just walk through it real quick for everyone, just to remind you. We have a rich agenda, starting off with two important keynote speeches from Mr. Poneman, the Deputy Secretary here at Department of Energy, and then Mr. Beers, Deputy Assistant to the President for Homeland Security at the National Security Council staff. We'll then, at around 9:35, have a fireside chat with Mr. Poneman and Administrator Craig Fugate from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll come back and have a panel in which we change the tables up here, and we'll have a number of distinguished representatives of industry, as well as our federal partners, as well as the states. And we'll have a roundtable discussion over a number of the preparedness issues confronting us in energy emergency management. 12:30, we'll break for lunch, and that will be here in the cafeteria, Department of Energy. We'll be live streaming this on energy.gov until the panel discussion at 10:40, by the way, for everyone. And then we'll resume in the afternoon, transitioning from executive seminar to tabletop exercise, and that will be facilitated. That will go the length of the afternoon until about 4 o'clock when Deputy Secretary Poneman returns, and we will sum up the day as far as action items, conclusions, and way forward for the coming hurricane season. So a couple of administrative announcements just for your benefit. In the event of an emergency, there will be an alarm sounding. We will exit through the way you came in here, exit signs in the back, and there are a number of folks wearing green polo shirts with Department of Energy ESF 12 on them. Go ahead and follow them. They will lead us to safety. The rally point will be across Independence Avenue over by the castle. Won't be hard to find over there. With respect to restrooms and water fountains, as you exit the door here to the right side, and then it'll be to the left, so it's just down the hall there. Let me turn now to introduce our first keynote speaker, and that is, of course, Deputy Secretary Daniel Poneman, who has been the Deputy Secretary here at DOE since May 2009, and that includes a stint serving as Acting Secretary from April to May of 2013. Mr. Poneman has had a very distinguished career in government, including service at the Department of Energy and the National Security Council staff. He's also had a distinguished career in the private sector, where he was a principal in the Scowcroft Group and was a partner at Hogan and Hartson. He's a lawyer by training. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Poneman. Sir.
Thank you, Kevin, and please don't hold this lawyer thing against me. I haven't practiced in 13 years. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I do want to note that during the month I served as acting secretary, there were no hurricanes. I'm not imputing any correlation there. Let's start with a good morning. Just want to make sure there's a pulse out there. Okay. I am actually here representing Secretary Moniz. Regrettably, you find in government that sometimes the higher you go, the less control you have over your schedule, and there's one boss above us all who can convoke, and that power was exercised. So he is unfortunately over at the White House right now, but I'm honored to speak in his stead, and I'll be honored to be with you later today. I cannot exaggerate the importance of this exercise, and many of us had a real birth of fire in Hurricane Sandy. That's not the best way to start. You don't want to be at the bottom end of a learning curve when something like that hits. I think people rallied incredibly. I'm both proud and grateful and impressed by everything that was done. But one of the immediate takeaways from that exercise, from that experience, was the importance of exercising, and that you're taking time, all of you, both here in the room and around the complex on the screens who are participating. I really, and on behalf of the Secretary, want to express our deepest thanks and gratitude, because this is what spells the difference between success and failure in the event. I know that many of us here in this room spent hours and hours, some putting up cots in FEMA headquarters. We'll hear from Administrator Fugate in a little while to get through that searing experience. 8.5 million customers, both residences and obviously businesses and all kinds of facilities that had a huge responsibility in terms of keeping people alive in hospitals and in senior citizen facilities and providing for public safety. All of them were affected, and that's why it was impressive, but it was not surprising to me when we heard time and again the President resort to this statement: after preservation of life and limb, restoration of power is our highest priority. And the second corollary inevitably followed, and I've got witnesses here who saw this. He said, I will have zero tolerance for red tape. So I'm just going to pause here. I want to thank some of the people you already know, and if I thanked everybody who was deeply involved, I would exhaust the balance of my time. So I'm just going to be very selective, and I got to say a big shout out to Pat Hoffman, our Assistant Secretary. Her office name is long, but so are the responsibilities that go with it. She has been a star. She has forgotten more about infrastructure than most people will ever know. And then right next to her, and soon to follow, my dear friend and a great patriot, a great American, Rand Beers, who has been Acting Secretary of Homeland Security and who is now our Deputy National Security Advisor. It's interesting. I think Rand and I have known each other almost 30 years by now. We worked together in the White House, and we both come out of a national security background. I find that entirely consistent with the mission space we now occupy, because what we are talking about fundamentally relates to our long-term national security. The threat that we face is evolving. The vulnerabilities that we face are complex and wide-ranging, and we have to understand that we have moved into a different secular phase of really life on this planet. Between 2003 and 2013, 9 out of the 10 most devastating hurricanes in history were experienced, leading to a loss of $320 billion worth of value and affecting communities all across the eastern seaboard. I wish I could tell you that this was an aberration, but it's not. All of the science indicates, and we're going to come back to that in a minute, that this is a scene that, alas, is going to be repeated over and over again. The president has been eloquent on this, talking about the science and how clearly the scientific case has been made, but you don't need to be a scientist to see the raging floods, the torrential storms, the devastating droughts, the fire seasons start earlier and last longer. 84% of our carbon emissions are energy related. So those of us at the Department of Energy who are working on that side of the equation have a huge responsibility in front of us to try to bend the curve on the carbon emissions that come out of our economy so that we can avert the most catastrophic possibilities that could be visited upon us by climate change. I invite you all to take a look at the latest National Climate Assessment. It is a chilling document, and there's a great webcast by Dr. John Holdren, the President's Science Advisor, but you can go to any part of this country, and you can see the threats that we face on the eastern seaboard from flooding. You can see the threats that we face along the Gulf Coast. We get half of our oil from the Gulf of Mexico, and the infrastructure there and the refineries there are exquisitely vulnerable to these torrential storms. And it's something that is, as I said, is getting worse. And the National Climate Assessment assesses that this could cost us on the order of $8 billion by 2030. I was out in Los Angeles. We were meeting with the Climate Preparedness Task Force, and to see what Governor Brown has got to deal with in terms of the drought out there and the impact that that's having in California, it is truly and deeply troubling. We see a rise in the frequency of these storms, harsher droughts, sea level rise, and escalating summer temperatures. Its bottom line is our aging infrastructures cannot take that level of punishment. Now, the very complexity and breadth of the challenge, I think, is what has inspired the president to ask us to carry out a first ever quadrennial energy review. You know, there's a long tradition in the U.S. government of thoughtful, sort of over-the-horizon analyses originated by the Pentagon many years ago with the Quadrennial Defense Review. Well, one of the recommendations of the President's Council on Advisors on Science and Technology, and frankly at that point one of the key proponents and intellectual fathers of the concept was then Professor Ernest Moniz, and so it's only just that this comes back around, recommended that we take a holistic view of the energy economy, not just from a DOE perspective, in fact, not just from a federal perspective, but looking across all of our infrastructures. As you all know here, most of our energy infrastructures are owned privately, and we have to have a thoughtful and thoroughgoing analysis of how all of these factors interact. And so the President launched the Quadrennial Energy Review. It is being led in the White House, and it is being staffed in no small measure by people here at the Energy Policy and Systems Evaluation Office that's being led by Melanie Kenderdine. Through this QER, we're taking an administration-wide effort to develop an integrated roadmap of actions to ensure that our nation's energy infrastructure can provide the affordable, clean, and secure energy services that are essential for this country's economic productivity and our way of life. Because of the challenges that brought all of us here today, the first task in this QER is to look precisely at questions of energy transmission, distribution, and storage. And I don't have to explain to anyone here why that was deemed to be the most urgent priority in this very complex multi-year process of the Quadrennial Energy Review. The vast networks that we are talking about deliver affordable heat, fuel, and power to 300 million consumers in this country every single day. They also expand far beyond our borders and engage us with the rest of the world. So we are here at the beginning of another hurricane season, and I'll pause to acknowledge we've been joined by Administrator Craig Fugate. I have never been in a meeting with Administrator Fugate that I didn't come out knowing something I didn't know going in, and we are all, I can't exaggerate how incredibly fortunate we are, and the President is, and the country is, to have somebody of his capability, his passion, his dedication dedicated to these efforts. And it has now become, at least for me, a sort of rite of passage as we go through May to think through how are we doing? How are we doing getting ready for the next hurricane season? How are we doing at assimilating the lessons from the last hurricane season? And for us in the energy sector, as the backbone as we are in so many aspects of this nation's economy, we have really got to, as Secretary Moniz likes to say, step up our game, and we are now dealing with this increasingly as a core mission of the U.S. Department of Energy. We have done some good things, we have made some progress, but you will not see complacency as part of our lexicon. We always can do better. We always must try to do better. We've got to get better at communications. We've got to get better at situational awareness. We've got to get better at response mechanisms, and we have to just keep exercising, and that's, again, why today's activities here are so important. I'd like to just mention a few of the things in particular that the Department of Energy has done since Hurricane Sandy, and end with that list of beginnings of our enhanced efforts so we can hear from our esteemed colleagues and specifically the next keynote from Rand Beers. The first thing we realized, apart from the lack of situational awareness that was pervading the whole East Coast during those early days, is from an institutional perspective, even within the U.S. Department of Energy, we were stovepiped. We didn't even know across our own complex, in every instance, who was doing what, when, and with whom. And so Secretary Moniz asked me to chair an Energy Incident Management Council. We actually meet regularly. It has been, I think, enormously productive in terms of knitting some of the things together that were not previously integrated. I'll just give you one simple example. My pre-Sandy earliest intense experience with emergency response was the Fukushima nuclear incident, March 11, 2011 in Japan. We had an incredibly complex, again, White House-led effort. At that time, Deputy National Security Advisor Dennis McDonough chaired video conferences. When I had served in government 20 years ago, you could barely get one screen on for a video conference. There must have been 20 or up to 30 entities, because when you think of the complexity of who was involved, everything from the EPA to the Centers for Disease Control, that was an incredibly complex exercise. We have a whole infrastructure on the nuclear side that has been built up over decades to deal with emergency response, and we had in parallel a very modest effort in terms of the technology pedestal upon which the effort was based on the storm response side. So we have to integrate where we are more advanced in the department and have more sophisticated capabilities, and where we have needs that are now growing as we see and are required really into the President's Climate Action Plan to be more responsive, more effective. So that was one initiative that we took. The Secretary also directed us to see how we could more effectively incorporate our field structure into our headquarters efforts, and we've been exercising that. And for one example, our power marketing administrations now are much more deeply integrated. Before Hurricane Sandy, they really weren't. And in Sandy, they deployed bucket trucks, they deployed linemen, they deployed expertise, and now we're building that into our systems. We have actually continued a tradition that started during Hurricane Sandy, which is regular interaction with CEOs, not only across the industry among the utilities, but also with all of the trade associations. And I'm very pleased that NRECA and APPA and EEI are all here represented. And I apologize for the alphabet soup, but you all know who you are, and the entities that you represent are incredibly important. They're incredibly integral to our overall efforts, and frankly, we will not succeed. We will fail if we don't, I would say, double down on our cooperation with all of these entities and the enterprises that they represent. The Secretary also directed the National Petroleum Council to undertake a study, which is now underway, on emergency preparedness. And the National Petroleum Council is a great organization. It goes back to Harold Ickes, who was Secretary of Interior, I think, during both Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman administration, and he was the one who launched this group. It does very thorough, very thoughtful studies. They typically take a long time, but Secretary Moniz said in this case the urgency of the need could not be accommodated by the usual timeline of a long study, so they're trying to accomplish in really just a few months what they'll typically take well over a year to complete. And we really thank the National Petroleum Council for their effort. I would also note incredibly good work that was done by the American Petroleum Institute post-Hurricane Sandy in building a model of how the different links in the energy chain are built out. One thing that we came to understand better and was briefed to the President was the interstices between the fuel side and the electric side, and how important it is to understand exactly where the kinks in the chain are. On May 2nd, the Secretary announced the establishment of a regional refined petroleum product reserve as part of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which complements the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve that we already had in the Northeast and that we tapped for the first time ever during Hurricane Sandy. The idea is that 1 million barrels of gasoline now would be put effectively alongside the 1 million barrels of diesel that's available in the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve, so I won't have to say NEHOR. Then that would provide some assurance in the event of a storm that we've got that capacity as well. Finally, and I said I would come back to this, we've been focused on bringing our disaster response capability into the 21st century. The modest pedestal that we had to support the data on this before, which we called Eagle Eye, which only had a couple hundred users. Now we have users all across the federal government, and we have been working very hard to strengthen that pedestal so that it can provide the support, providing information on where the outages are, and both on the natural gas side and on the electric side, and will allow us to be much more effective in directing our disaster response efforts. And thanks to our Presidential Management Fellow, Derek Frempong, and we're very proud of him, he has put together a mobile application which we call Lantern Live, so that one first salient problem we all noticed during Hurricane Sandy of not knowing on the East Coast which gas stations had power, no gas, gas, no power, both or neither, could be cured by this mobile app you can put on your iPhone. You'll be able to find out where the gas stations are that are still operating. You'll be able to find out where the power outages are. You'll be able to find out useful information that we'll make available through our links. And that guy is incredible, and we're very proud of him, and I'm looking forward to getting this thing out of beta testing into wider circulation. In conclusion, while much of the nation's infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, everybody, public, private, state, federal, everybody's got a very important role to play. And as in so many things, there's so many things that can go wrong, and for us to get through the challenges that we're going to face, all of us have to step up our game, and it's going to be impossible, I think, to do that if we don't spend more time with each other, if we don't simulate real-life experiences, if we don't have the opportunity to test innovative solutions in a safe environment and not do everything on the fly when the actual crisis hits, as most assuredly it will, as most assuredly it does every year. Just to be clear, and both Mr. Beers and Administrator Fugate know this very well, this is not just about responding to today's storms. We had a very extensive process that was chaired by Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Sean Donovan, to look at how to build our infrastructure in a resilient way, so that not only are we coping with the reality of today's storms with today's infrastructure, but as we rebuild, that we rebuild in a smart, robust, resilient way, one that is more protective of our people across the nation as they suffer from these increasingly devastating storms and floods. This day, in short, is an integral part of an enterprise that I think is important not only to everybody here participating in the conference, but to everybody in the country. I couldn't be more grateful to our colleagues for participating, and I want to thank everyone here and wish everyone a very successful day and a successful exercise. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deputy Secretary Poneman. Our next keynote speaker is Mr. Rand Beers, who's currently the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor on the National Security Council staff. Mr. Beers comes to that position from being the Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, as well as the Acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security. And prior to that, since June 2009, Mr. Beers was the Undersecretary for National Protection and Programs Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security, where he also served concurrently as the Secretary's Counterterrorism Coordinator. Mr. Beers' distinguished federal career or career in national service began as a U.S. Marine serving in Vietnam. He later joined the Foreign Service and rose up through the ranks of the Department of State up to the rank of Assistant Secretary, then joined the NSC staff and served under 4 different presidents, covering portfolios ranging from counterterrorism to counter-narcotics to peacekeeping and to intelligence programs, reminding me that along with Deputy Secretary Poneman and Administrator Fugate, I do not want to play Jeopardy with these gentlemen. So with that, let me turn to Mr. Beers. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. It's it's really a pleasure to be here today with old friends and colleagues like Dan and Craig and Pat. I think we've got a really exciting day ahead, and I think that the bringing together of all of the various groups represents the path forward in terms of dealing with this. While we're focused on hurricanes today, I just want to say that what we think about and do and work on in this particular area with this particular hazard is also valuable for all other kinds of hazards and threats that we might face. It's also, I think, important to note that this particular meeting is extraordinarily timely in terms of our preparation for hurricane season, both because it is coming upon us, but also as both Craig and Dan know, because they will also be there, we're briefing the President tomorrow on hurricane, and both of these individuals will have a prominent part. So I think this discussion will hopefully add to the discussion that we have with the President tomorrow. As I said, I think it's really important to remember that what we can do here today has additional value. We know from Hurricane Sandy, if we didn't know it before, how critical power and fuel is to a disaster. I would add to Dan's priority order a slight amendment, which is that while the preservation of life is the first priority, power is often an element of preserving that life, so that already we have between the first 2 priorities an interdependency that we really have to acknowledge and be mindful of in any particular crisis. As we all know, the power grid system has been around for a long time, and that's a blessing and a problem. It's a blessing because of what it gives to us in our economy, and it's a problem because the age of it represents a vulnerability that we have to be conscious of. And that's why conferences such as these, I think, are important. And while investments are being made or have been made, we still have to deal with permitting issues and maintenance issues as well as weather events, and that's contributed to some important and increasing numbers of failures and power interruptions, and I think that has to be something that we take with us. And we also have to acknowledge that in this particular environment, the increase in consumers that we can predict over the next several years is only going to make this an even more complicated issue to try to deal with. I would like to focus specifically on three things that I think are really important in driving our federal approach to resilience. The first is refining and clarifying the functional relationships across the federal government. Dan talked about finding his way within the Energy Department. That is a phenomenon that is writ large across the federal government, and it's important that we take the lessons that we learn from disasters and use them for teaching moments, as many say, in order to clarify these relationships so that we don't have to repeat the same mistake twice. The second thing is to enable information exchanges in a more effective and more rapid manner. As our society has succeeded in creating a far wider range of information, we have to take advantage of that information and find ways in which we can use that, and creating those relationships in information exchange and making that information available to the widest variety of people in order to have that available in order to resolve these kinds of issues. Dan mentioned the mobile app, which will be in fact briefed to the President tomorrow as an example of how to try to bring that kind of information together to resolve these issues. It would have been an extraordinarily valuable app to have had during Hurricane Sandy, but I think now we will have that to look forward to. And lastly, the analysis of all of this information. It's fine, well, and good to be able to exchange the information, but if you don't, it doesn't stand out by itself and say, this is important or that is important. We need the tools that can analyze that information and do a much better job of pinpointing where we need to focus our attention. So I talk about those three things because I think that they're vitally important. I want to note the fact that in addition to the people from the private sector and from state and locals that we have here, in addition to energy and FEMA, we also have the Department of Interior, the Department of Transportation, the Corps of Engineers from the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and EPA. And if I've left anybody out, I apologize for that. But I just want to call people's attention that when I talk about trying to integrate the federal government, that's part of what this conference, I think, can help us to do in terms of bringing both the federal family together to talk about these issues together with the people on the forefront at state and local and private sector entities. Finally, I just want to redouble what Dan said about resilience. This has become a absolutely critical feature as we think about going forward into the years ahead. If climate change and Hurricane Sandy weren't enough, the wildfires, the other hazards that we face on a regular basis represent a real threat moving forward to the economy and to the well-being of our citizens. And as we look down this path, we are making a major effort on the part of the federal government, but together with state and local and private sector entities to look to the future and to rebuild and to modify our infrastructure to make it much more resilient. If you look at the flood maps and how they are changing, if you look at the storm surge maps and how they are changing as a result of climate change, it's an absolutely critical area that we need to focus on in order to ensure that we are not only safe today and tomorrow, but in the years ahead. And there's nothing like planning and taking advantage of this to, I think, set ourselves on a long-term sustainable course. And finally, in terms of the public-private partnership, just to say that it is absolutely critical. We quote the 85% of all critical infrastructure is in the private sector. That's not just a throwaway quote. That's an absolutely critical understanding on the part of all of us that we can't do this without working together with the private sector. We have a number of ways in which we do that. At the top of that pyramid in the National Infrastructure Plan, we are focusing on using the sector coordinating councils as the principal entities for coordinating government-wide relationships with the private sector. And while these are private sector run organizations, they are absolutely critical, and it is absolutely critical that those of you who have representatives on those coordinating councils ensure that they are fully informed and representative of your concerns and your thoughts, and that you regularly have an opportunity to absorb the dialogue that goes on, the rich dialogue that goes on in those coordinating councils. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion and the results of this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Beers. Thank you, Deputy Secretary Poneman. So at this point, we'll transition to the fireside chat portion of the agenda, and for that, I'll invite Deputy Secretary Poneman to one of these chairs here, as well as Administrator of FEMA, Mr. Craig Fugate. I've introduced Mr. Poneman already. I'll introduce Mr. Fugate now. He is, of course, the Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, where he has been since May 2009. And during that time, Mr. Fugate has undertaken a number of priority and successful initiatives to revitalize the way this nation does emergency management. Those include adopting a whole community approach, welcoming or bringing in all partners, implementation of the National Preparedness System under Presidential Policy Directive number 8, and focusing as well, most importantly, on outcomes for survivors by what we push out the door here. Prior to FEMA, Mr. Fugate served as the director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management, where he led the state response to the 2004 hurricane season, in which, of course, the state dealt with 4 major hurricanes. And he began his emergency management career as a firefighter and paramedic. So we're going to take till about 10:30 now and go through a number of questions. And I was just going to set the stage a little bit by going back to the Sandy after action report that the federal interagency developed, or that the White House developed, and just cite a couple statistics with respect to the response there. First, starting out with power restoration. And during the Sandy response, we, of course, or the U.S. Transportation Command, airlifted 299 power restoration vehicles, 487 personnel to help states restore power. The Corps of Engineers assessed 587 locations for temporary power and installed 211 generators, providing 55 megawatts of power. Defense Logistics Agency shipped 51 generators with a total capacity of 71 megawatts, enough to support 71,000 families. And of course, our electrical utility partners executed mutual aid agreements and deployed over 70,000 workers to affected areas. The President directed DOE to use the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve. And among other things, the report highlighted At the federal level, just a challenge with respect to operational capability, a problem I think many of the people in the room here experience when it comes to energy emergency incident management. So with those as background, I wanted to open up the first question really to our two distinguished guests here and really ask the question of as far as expectation setting and what does success look like and how should we be thinking about a reasonable federal response to future incidents like Sandy. I'll start with Deputy Secretary Poneman, sir.
Thank you. Well, first, I'd like to note, I thought that after-action report that you just chronicled was very important, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Deputy Assistant Secretary Bill Bryan for his work in that. So a lot of the lessons we've applied there. Let me try to distill down into just some broad areas what I think success looks like, and then we'll hear much more from Craig Fugate. I am helped by mnemonic devices. So I think of this in terms of the letter R. As I said in my prepared remarks, the first thing that I realized we needed was real-time information. So success to me in the first instance looks like we know what's going on. And I remember many years ago at the National Security Council doing a staff ride up to Gettysburg and looking at the difference between what goes on in the U.S. military today versus when they fought the Battle of Gettysburg. The first critical distinction is now you go down, you radio out your coordinates. Back then you had to send out people with dispatches and hope somebody found somebody. So the analogy is today we've got to know where it hurts. We've got to know where the assets have the ability to be corrected in real time. If there's a transfer switch available at a particular gas station, so you know the generator hookup can be effectuated without using jackhammers and putting in new switches, and that's just a very small example. So that's the first piece. The second thing is regional relationships. And this, I'll confess to you, is something I didn't understand, and again, Brian helped me understand this. Just having people in the same region who know each other and who know their authorities are complementary and need to be harnessed together. So for example, there is a waiver for transportation regulations that prevent people from driving too long, but if you have an emergency, you need them to be able to do that. It's not just enough for that person to know it. They've got to communicate it to the badged officer at the place, and it's got to be made known in such a way that the person who's driving the truck through knows. So we need to have regional relationships, state, federal level. We need the first responders to be tied into it in a very integrated fashion. But in the long term, we need resilient infrastructure so that it isn't so creaky. You know, everyone knows this, but we've got aging infrastructure. Our transformers and transmission lines are all, on average, over 25 years old, and some much over 25 years old. Our power gen sets are 30 years old and older. And again, to come up with a more resilient situation, we've been working on microgrids in areas like New Jersey, where you make sure that those vital corridors, if people have to evacuate from New York City, should they suffer some outage in their grid, that they have alternate backup. You have self-healing grids, you have combined heat and power options, you have distributed generation options, so that we are not so brittle and so dependent on single points, or vulnerable to, I should say, single points of failure. So I would say the 3 R's: real-time awareness, regional relationships, and resilient infrastructure.
Thanks, sir. Administrator Fugate.
The power comes on before we have civil unrest.
Period. Dot.
That's why I like working with this guy. I told you I learn every time.
So along those lines, Administrator Fugate, then, since the Superstorm Sandy and the response there, what are some of the improvements you'd point to as far as going back to the President's direction to cut the red tape? How have we improved as far as cutting red tape, or how have we improved authorities, operational capabilities, and so forth?
Well, I think 2 things. When the President said cut red tape, there were 2 things that were absolutes that people tend to not want to hear. 1, we cannot suspend the laws of nature. And 2, we can't break the law. And much of the law we deal with is not federal, it's state law. How many of you are investor on utilities? When we say resiliency, what does that mean to your shareholders? Cost. We design our systems both from the municipal, because they're held accountable by electing their local officials, to state regulatory entities that regulate most electrical distribution in this country, to anybody that has to go before their shareholders, to design a system that provides the greatest return on investment at the greatest efficiency at the least amount of cost. And what resiliency is built in there is usually built upon the tolerance of our customers to purchase our product without abandoning us and going somewhere else because we're reliable enough for their day-to-day needs. That's the system you build, that's what you got. When everybody talks about building resiliency, unless somebody else is paying, or we change the regulations, or your customers no longer will tolerate the disruptions, the market forces won't change. You always go back to a steady state with a minimal amount of investment to get the greatest return on that. Whether you're a city elected official who regulates a municipal utility, or you're an investor-owned, or even a co-op. That's the nature of the dynamics of the system. So within that, we have to look at what is realistically the issue of how much resilience can we afford as a nation, or more importantly, how much can we not afford? And this really comes back to, it may be a flipped answer, but what we have found, experienced in Florida, particularly in Hurricane Wilma, we dealt with power outages for weeks. Now, there was a lot of frustration, but there was no unrest. There was a lot of inconvenience, but there wasn't an end to the world. So there's a balance between how fast we can afford to build resiliency and what we will spend to get power turned back on, versus at what point will the public no longer tolerate that. And what we found in Florida, probably the biggest point of friction for the public, was lack of information. It wasn't that the power was going to be out for weeks, it was that nobody could tell them how long power could be out so they could plan. So again, we just don't magically, after some catastrophic disaster, and again, we don't respond to hurricanes. We respond to the consequences of disasters. And so with a hurricane, we oftentimes get power outages over large areas, and that becomes a huge response to restore energy in those areas. But what it really comes down to, I think, is how do we build resiliency in the system so that we can deal with the needs of the community to basically stabilize, stop the loss, begin the restoration, keep the public informed. And again, that's why we go to great expense to install generators. That's why we are looking at all kinds of ways to speed up the process. But it is something that, again, on the federal side, I think the President gave us clear guidance that our internal processes should not delay the things we can do. Many people were questioning some of the actions we took during Hurricane Sandy and going, can you do that? And we're basically going, well, Congress never told us we couldn't do it. And we have some statutory authority in the Stafford Act. We have some authorities within the National Response Framework. The President has authorities. Even within the departments, they have authorities that they can do extraordinary things in times of emergencies. And what really I think the President meant by cutting red tape was, don't get in your own way because you haven't done it before, or you had self-imposed restrictions. And I think that's the other part of this is, you know, we talk about building within the federal framework, the understanding of what the authorities of the agency are, how to best work to support what ultimately is going to be in the governor's hands, their state regulatory community, and the state-based utilities, whether you're an investor-owned across multiple states or you're a muni that works just one part of the area. You know, just talking electrical, it's a system that we've dealt with a lot, but I think you have to talk about energy as a whole. You just can't segment just electrical. You got to talk about fuels as well, because we've seen the whole issue of how that now interacts. So to me, success is that within our own capabilities, working in partnership with the governors who have the lead for these responses, we maximize the restoration focused on the most key infrastructure to keep communities alive and stabilized. But we also communicate with the public so they know what to expect and understand why it's taking so long, and that we're doing everything in our effort. My observation is, as long as the public thinks you're doing everything you can, they are much more tolerant of delays. It's in the absence of information, or where they see confusion or various people talking and we have mixed messages, the public loses confidence. And when you lose confidence in the public, things come undone. And that's where you start looking at, once they've lost confidence that government can somehow affect the outcome, then it gets ugly.
Thank you, sir. Deputy Secretary Poneman.
Well, that was a very thorough answer. I'm just going to add just a little color to put a human face to this, because I think very telling, you just heard from Craig Feud, how ubiquitous power is. Information is as the critical aspect, and how people can be patient if they know what's going on. The next morning, after the president made that comment about having no tolerance for red tape, Craig Fugate went into the headquarters of FEMA, pulled a bunch of us together from all the different agencies. I think his speech, you know, the Gettysburg Address was about 2 minutes. This was maybe that, not much more. And basically he said, y'all heard the president last night. Zero tolerance for red tape. You know what to do. Now go do it. And he walked out. He walked out. Because I want to put a human face to this. We can talk about all the structural things. We need to. But it comes down to people. I see Bob there. People who rise to the occasion. And when Craig Fugate walked out the door, we had been having, at that point, about a 17-hour discussion about how to get bucket trucks into the affected area. And we had a smart, talented White House person, Asha Tribble, who we were smart enough to get to come over here and help us set up our system. And after Craig walked out the door, it was within a matter of maybe an hour, and then you heard the whir of C-17s mustering in California. And it ain't just about those people in that room. Those people in that room reached out in 100 different directions. Air Force, I gotta give huge kudos to the investor-owned utilities out in California, Tony Early and Ted Craver in PSE&G and Southern California Edison. And that's just one microcosm of what Craig's talking about. So you can have all the structures in the world, but you've got to motivate, animate, and empower people to do the things that will allow us effectively, as you just put it, Craig, get out of our own way. And we just have to build that more and more into our DNA.
Let me address the item in the Sandy Attractor report with respect to operational capability. And obviously, you both have cited the extraordinary efforts, including moving bucket trucks and related personnel. And is that something that we want to designate as extraordinary, or is that the new normal as far as load redistribution is concerned? Where do you see this hurricane season? You know, what's the federal responsibility, or what are the things we want to do would be in the this is an emergency break glass category?
Depends upon where it hits. One observation I made is those areas of the country that have not experienced significant power outages due to any disaster, it's oftentimes very challenging. Those that have actually practiced and run the mutual aid. What we know of how to speed that process up, I think, really comes back to let's be honest, flying utility trucks is not the most efficient way to get power back on. But it was very symbolic of what the president meant by we will do whatever it takes. So again, it comes back to, I know a lot of times when we deal with industry, you would like to get rid of the inconvenience of having to work through the states. Unfortunately, that's our Constitution, and I don't think that's red tape either. So we have a system that was never designed to be an ultra-efficient system to respond to disasters. It's based upon our 50 states and territories having the governance and regulation over much of your activities that are not federal. So there's not the ability for the federal government just to step in and waive all of the state regulations or supersede governors or nationalize response. They do that in other socialist-based countries south of Florida, not to the betterment of their people. So we try to avoid that form of government and stick with ours. It works for us before, it works in disasters, but it also means you can't fight it. You have to understand that in many cases what the federal government can do is based upon our ability to influence, advise, and consult, and really focus on federal regulatory burden or restrictions that affect your ability to get power back on. But we still have to work through the states. And again, the better the relationship, the better experience within that state. The fact that many states that have gone through this, utilities sit as part of the state team. There's not this idea of a separate entity. They are actually in the state emergency operations centers working with the state, because what we know is power outages drive 90% of the response outside of the area of absolute devastation. The power comes back on, the private sector can meet community issues and demands the response then narrows down to the most adversely affected parts, where the actual damage is. But in those states where utilities are not part of that team, we have a lot of challenges. You have a lot of challenges. So part of this is taking what we have learned and going to other states and going, if you're in Florida, and Brian Coon's EOC, and back in the energy section, you have a state regulatory agency, but you also have the representatives of the utilities in there. Brian doesn't have to call energy to find out how bad his power situation is. He's got his utilities in there telling him. When Brian's putting in points of distribution and working with the private sector, they know what the power restoration best estimates are to make those plans. That's what we know are best practices. We also know other things that people were gun shy about turn out to be very effective for the fuel industry. Using something like rationing, which everybody said was political suicide, until Governor Christie said we're doing odd and even, because what was happening was public perception and consumption was out of whack of what the system could deliver. And you could not normalize. So consumption was never, the public's perception of what was needed was never being met until he said, we're going to odd even rationing. Now things didn't get better materially overnight, but confidence went, okay, they got a plan. Demand went down, the system was able to normalize. We moved into a steady state while the systems were being rebuilt. But it's those relationships that are built at the state level, and our role is to best practices, support and encourage that, but also look at, on the federal side, are our regulatory activities precluding or limiting or restricting capabilities of response? And are there things that we could do extraordinarily to speed that response up that we can do in a temporal area? Notwithstanding those regulations are there for a reason. They just don't get suspended indefinitely, but for that period of time of stabilization. And I think that's really when the president speaks to get rid of the red tape, is we got to get stabilized before we can go back to why we were doing the regulations in the first place. And if this isn't a statutory issue, then why can't we do this?
Thanks, sir. Deputy Secretary Pyman, anything to add?
Look, I would just add the following. In terms of getting out of our own way, that's an absolutely critical point. Now, the electrical sector has had decades of experience with their mutual assistance network, and everybody here knows that the electrical utility industry is vastly different in more ways than you can count from the fuels industry. That having been said, during Sandy, when we reached out to the fuel side, A, they didn't have the tradition of working together. B, the first thing that says we can't really talk to each other because of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Well, I'm sure if Senator Sherman were alive today, what he was not worried about was people helping each other during a storm. He was worried about price fixing and all kinds of things. But that's, these people have lawyers. That's a statutory issue. That's something we got to figure out how to get around that, because we now understand how deeply interconnected those two sides are. By the same token, Craig's absolutely right. It's facilitating those kinds of communications. And our power is making these connections that otherwise might not get made. It's what I witnessed during Sandy. But also, there are things, all of these things are passed for virtuous reason. We have a Clean Air Act for a purpose. And so vapor recovery units are not trivial things. But, there are times in which you got to get out of the way to solve an imminent crisis. And so that's the kind of thing we're talking about. That's the kind of thing we built into this after action report. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to get better at as we roll through these various crises year to year.
Let me pick up on the theme that each state is significant in its own way as far as its level of preparedness and its consequent needs during a disaster, and ask really what we're doing at the federal level, especially with respect to Emergency Support Function 12, in terms of reaching out, assessing their preparedness, and doing joint planning for improving their resilience. Let me start with Deputy Secretary Pyman.
Yeah, well, we've done a lot. We, as I said, we've gotten our own house in order within the DOE. We just had a conference among all the ESF 12 entities participating so that everyone knows each other, so when the storm hits, they are able to build those relationships. We are now integrating our power marketing administrations for the first time, and they are developing their own ConOps to make their contributions known. So we're doing a lot of that kind of on a day-to-day basis. We had a couple of months ago, and I want to thank Jerry Cawley and NERC for really driving this thing, a very, I think, important exercise where we went through a lot of these kinds of challenges, including both cyber and physical assaults on the grid. But the same sorts of responders are involved, the same sorts of legal authorities are involved, and this continual exercising of the capacity that we've got, getting more and more people trained up. We threw out a challenge to our field offices. You know, again, we take a page out of our experience in the nuclear realm. You have people who are on tethers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week throughout the year. If something goes wrong and you need to field a team and some palletized equipment to deal with some kind of nuclear emergency, we are ready to roll. We got to get, obviously, that good on other aspects of the enterprise. We have I will tell you, we have a modest-sized, well-trained core of people. I'm not even going to tell you the number right now because we got to build it up. And so when the Field Management Council came in, and people from our world, Department of Energy knows, these are all the folks at the various sites. We got 115,000 people more or less in our complex, of whom about 100,000 are contractors in the national labs and the production sites. We got to get them involved so that they're trained up so that they can help. And so what I'm saying is that we have done some work, but we realize we've got to double down and, as Secretary Moniz says, step up our game, make sure that we have not only at the leadership level, but people who can actually go out to the regions. If we mean what we say about having all those regional relationships, we've got to have the staff and the support that can make that happen.
Thank you. Among the other items in the extraordinary effort category during Sandy was the effort to get situational awareness onto the status of gas stations. And we've talked about the fuel sector. And I pose a question to you both as far as, obviously we've talked about a number of the different applications and social media solutions here. Where do you see us going as far as being able to deliver information to the affected areas in terms of the status of accessibility to fuel? And take a step further, you know, what's the federal role as far as providing fuel to those private vendors?
Well, I'll make a brief comment on both of those points. I will admit, I've learned a lot just living through this. And during Sandy, when people said, I don't know, maybe we should use social media to find out who's got gas and so forth, my immediate reaction was, whoa, that's terrible, because we should know that. That's an important federal function. You know, we should have that. We should have Energy Information Administration somehow getting the data. You know, I went out to the Petroleum Marketers Association and so forth. It was real hard. And I'm no longer skeptical about there is so much power in the information of people who are out and about taking pictures, you know, going to specific gas stations, that if we can tap into that, and by the way, save the taxpayers some money at the same time, that's a great thing. So that's effectively what we have done, not to sort of get ahead of my skis in what we're going to be briefing here presently on this mobile application. We're very excited about it, but you got to understand that there are challenges with that too, because what you lose when you bring in crowdsourcing is sort of complete 100% control over the quality of the information. And God forbid there should be somebody out there who says, hey, I'm not going to tell them my gas station's open, right? You know, so you got to worry about, and we're actually building into the system ways to prevent people from gaming the system. But in short, you know, that's one of the things that we're relying on, in addition to the more traditional forms of information gathering and so forth that we, of course, will continue with the Energy Information Administration. And we're deepening our connectivity with the utilities and making sure that everything having to do with power is less reliant on people sort of phoning in data and getting more real feeds from the actual utilities and their systems and our own. So that's, what was the other, you had two questions. What was
Delivering
the second?
fuel, actually the federal role
Yeah,
in
so,
providing them.
You know, in many cases, we've of course found that the issue wasn't supply availability per se, but really the connectivity and getting fuel, you know, the distribution of the fuel. Part of the challenge here was finding the kinks in the system. And so the most immediate thing we have, of course, is huge. We're now down to 696 million barrels in our petroleum, strategic petroleum reserve, after the use of 30 million barrels to support Libya back in February of 2011. And we're using some of the proceeds out of that transaction to provide the support for developing this gasoline reserve. We got 1 million barrels of diesel in the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve. We found out successfully through good work with the Defense Logistics Agency, we're able to make that available as needed. But now we find, and it, as Craig said, it varies region by region, that in the Northeast, that there is a vulnerability in terms of gasoline shortages. And so we are now in the middle of a procurement to get 1 million barrels worth of gasoline, put them in 2 sites strategically on the eastern seaboard, so that if we have need for that resource, that it will be there. Now understand, I think in each half of the pad 1, it's about 2 million barrels a day in terms of our typical daily consumption. And so we're not here to tell you that this modest initial refined products reserve, the gasoline reserve, is going to provide a panacea instantly. In some measure, it does what Craig was talking about, which is it gives confidence that we got a backstopping mechanism that in extremis we can tap into to help keep people understanding that they don't need to hoard, they don't need to resort to what will ultimately be socially counterproductive kinds of self-help mechanisms.
Thank you, Mr. Fugate.
I've just learned you never say you're never going to do something. The history of providing fuel had always been at the request of the governor, at the request of the state, primarily focused on the emergency responders and some key infrastructure or critical infrastructure, which depending upon your definition can get pretty broad. In Hurricane Wilma, we were actually providing fuel to the National Hurricane Center staff out of Florida International University, out of some state resources to keep them from spending their 12 hours off shift looking for gas. So it really comes back to, in general, it is probably not the most effective utilization of our resources, nor are we really capable of providing gasoline products to the general public for normal consumption. I think that we found ourselves, when we started looking at just responders, that definition gets pretty broad because you started running into the issue of hospital staff. You started running into people you didn't normally think of as the lights and sirens crowd, but if you didn't get them fueled, they weren't going to be able to do their jobs. So again, I would say we never say never, but we primarily have been focused on the emergency response and critical infrastructure to stabilize the community. And I've mentioned Florida, I've mentioned Brian Kuhn, because I'll be leaving here. But I want you to know, you do have one of your state directors. I didn't see anybody else here, but Brian Kuhn, raise your hand. Brian Kuhn was appointed by Governor Rick Scott as the Emergency Management Director for Florida. So again, I always try to remind people we are a federalist government. States have a lot of primacy in the response to disasters. The authorities of the governor, their state emergency plans, their emergency authorities are quite extensive. And our role as the federal government national response framework is really supporting those governors in their request. So Kevin, if we got a request to provide gas to the public, we basically go against a rationalization of does that make sense? And if it was legitimate, we do it. But it is generally something that you want to take a step back and go, what is the outcome? And I think this is one of the things I really try to focus on, and this is what Dan was kind of talking about. The outcome when I walked in that meeting was everybody was debating about, whether this was a good idea. And I'm like going, that's no longer the discussion. The discussion is, this is the outcome the president expects we need to execute. So if you know what outcome you're trying to achieve, and you're saying this is, like you said, what does success look like? What does the governor expect? What outcome are they trying to change? Then that gives us the ability to look back among the federal government and go, is this a regulatory issue we could address through regulatory, such as the issue about various fuel availability during summer due to all of the various blends that are used? Can we waive those restrictions? However, states have a lot of this. States have anti-gouging laws, which oftentimes put price caps on available energy at the time of a disaster, not building any ability to put caps on there and saying, but the extraordinary cost of getting more fuel there is something that industry eats if they're not allowed to adjust for that, right? So, but those are state by states, and I have no magic wand to fix that. We have every state Department of Transportation motor compliance carrier, which our friends from DOT. They regulate loads and permit loads, and so when you're trying to run overweight loads or run drivers past their normal hours, you got to get waivers for that. Well, the federal government can do some of that, but the actual enforcement of that is every time you cross a state line, right? So again, it's very important that we understand that if you're not working through the governors and we're not working and understanding that system, you're oftentimes going to come to the federal government for a solution and we'll go, we feel your pain, but have you talked to the state? Because that's where we have to go back. So I think you've got a great resource in Brian. Unfortunately, Florida has a lot of history of this. And they have a very progressive relationship of working with both the fuel industries and the electrical industries as part of the EOC operation, because that's the way it is down there. You get so many disasters. So Brian's a great resource for you as you go through the conversations today.
Thank you. So public-private partnerships comes up all the time, is obviously integral, and this meeting, in fact, is is a product of efforts in that area. We've talked through a number of the waivers, a number of things the federal government can do to expedite delivery of service here, and those include the waivers, and we went through anti-gouging laws, the transportation restrictions, environmental restrictions, a variety of waivers there. What are some of our asks of our private sector partners as far as increasing resilience? And Mr. Administrator, you highlighted that it is fundamentally a matter of cost, and somebody has to pay the bill. So what are some of the things we can encourage pre-landfall, over time to improve the resiliency of the sector, both fuel and electric?
Well, I think part of this comes back into, I use this term loosely, which everybody then hates, but our ability to influence the private sector and the federal government is either through what I call bribes and extortions. Either we regulate you to do something, which everybody then passes that cost on to consumers because everybody is having to absorb that cost, so it's uniform across the industry, or we penalize you for not meeting certain criteria, or we try to incentivize that by either giving you tax credits, tax breaks, or we use grants and funding. So it's really from industry's perspective, given that in the financial realities we're in today, we don't have a lot of capability to fund with federal dollars resilience and private infrastructure. But are there things doing now without just basically going, okay, everybody wants tax credits and all the money thing? Are there things we're doing that are impediments to resilience? That if you came up with specific things and saying, from the standpoint of what you're trying to achieve through regulation, you're actually precluding us from being able to build resiliency, and we have common goals we can work towards, not necessarily ending up making the environment any more vulnerable or shifting more of the burden to the taxpayer. But are there things as a federal government we could look at and go, would it make more sense for us type of investment strategy or this to build resiliency? Because it's always going to be that dynamics when you got to go to your shareholders and you're going to spend more money to get the power on, but that's not necessarily going to generate more profit or revenue. Then how do you balance that between the demands of, you're responsible to your shareholders. I mean, you have the SEC all over you if you're sitting there spending money without any appropriate regard to those investors, right? So it's that balancing act. So it's really, I know what your wish list is, but pragmatically, how do we work together? And what are the things the federal government can do to, I hate to use the term incentivize because that tends to come back to revenue we don't have to give away. But are there things we can do in partnership that would make sense to build resiliency? And are there things that, again, when Sandy happened, we were flying up to meet with Governor Christie, and the president had me in his possession at the time. So he asked me this question, and when the president asks you questions, you're supposed to already know the questions. The National Security Council is supposed to tell you ahead of time. You're supposed to have 5,000 staff write the briefing papers. The attorney spent another week vetting it. You got to get it through the interagency clearance and have 27,000 people sign off on it. You got a deputies meeting and a principal meeting, and then you can tell the president the answer. Well, he asked me something without any of that. And he basically said, Craig, I think the debate about climate change is over. How are we going to deal with the future? Because whatever you think is happening, a lot of it seems to be happening more frequently. The term 100-year event used by the National Weather Service kind of lost its meaning about the second year I was here because I'd already been up to about my 8th or 9th 100-year event. But they're really the challenge the president says, we've been building to the past. We've been building to what was. How do we build for the future? And I think that's been really the challenge of, if we're going to talk about resiliency, we've got a lot of built infrastructure. That's not going to change overnight. But if we rebuild or build new, are we building to our past knowledge? Are we building to the future change? Whether it's economic drivers, whether it's cyber threats, whether it's changes in the environment, the frequency of disasters, consumption, distribution. Populations used to be migrating out of the cities, they've been migrating back in. All these forces that are changing, we always tend to go back and look at our past when we rebuild or we construct new instead of going, what's the future looking like? And are we building to the future, not our past? And that's probably when we talk about climate resiliency, the major driver at FEMA is when we rebuild something, we just can't rely upon the past 100 years of weather data to go, well, this is good enough. We have to look at what's the future and how critical is that to our national infrastructure.
Thanks, sir.
Just make a couple comments. Number one, in terms of the public-private partnership, this thing about getting out of our way, if you take for granted, which I think we agree on here, the importance of information. That's an area where we have been in our way in the past, and we are in the process of getting out of our way. We got to get more out of our way. We already talked about the antitrust issues. You know, we had an experience, and Craig was on the line, and I was in line with the president, with the CEOs of the utilities about the second day of Hurricane Sandy, and we said, we got to have better connectivity with the industry. And we said, well, why don't we just invite them into FEMA? You know, set up shop there. And somebody on the phone, of course, I don't know who was on the phone because it was 50 people on the phone, said, well, you can't do that. And somebody said, well, why not? And so we did it. And so that then became a practice. I guess it's the best practice. But I want to make another point about the federal government, because we do have a power to shape the future. It's a modest one, but it's an important one. President's Climate Action Plan, you know, all three pillars, I think, directly affect our global ability to deal with these things. The first one is mitigation, second one is adaptation, and the third one is international cooperation. On that first one, many of the things that we're going to do in mitigation space will end up building a new, you know, less dependent on carbon energy infrastructure that will have a smarter grid and more resilient grid at its core. Secondly, in terms of adaptation, you know, we have to work on all the challenges in terms of permitting for big transmission and so forth, and getting more robust in terms of whether you're dealing with storm problems or cyber problems or physical security problems a la Metcalf, how we're going to be resilient in terms of our transformers, our substations, and so forth. And the FERC's got a process that's doing that. So there are places where we can move the rudder. If the whole infrastructure, the 85% held in the private sector is the battleship, we do have a hand on the tiller in some of these places where we can help direct investments. We can have communications with NARUC so that when it comes to talking about rate recovery for some of these investments that are going to be important, that can have an effect. So, you know, I think what we have to do is be realistic about the modest tools at our disposal, but try to use those in a muscular fashion to build the kind of new infrastructure that's going to be more resilient, and, you know, over time it's going to provide greater protection against these terrible storms that are going to continue.
Those are terrific. I couldn't have asked for better closing comments, but I'll give you both an opportunity, just closing thoughts on what's been a terrific discussion and reinforcing my fear of not wanting to play Jeopardy with any of you.
Oh, I'm easy to play Jeopardy. I know one column. You know, we're going into hurricane season. You know, the forecast is you know, average, below average. You know, Hurricane Andrew occurred in a below average hurricane season. That was actually forecast to be below average, so that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. But I want to go back to what I said before. We don't respond to hurricanes, we respond to consequences. And although we're using hurricanes to talk about vulnerabilities and resiliency in the energy sector, of all of the things we deal with in a disaster, outside of the areas that have the physical damage, it is the disruption of energy that drives the majority of the cost to you as a taxpayer for recovery. It tends to be a short period of time measured in days to weeks, but it's also one of the most difficult times because what we depend upon for this nation is the private sector doing its job every day, meeting consumption demands across the spectrum, whether it's food, whether it's energy, whether it's healthcare. And without power, without fuel, that system cannot operate. And we as a federal government are neither big enough or smart enough to replicate what the private sector does every day. That's why energy becomes such a huge driver in the aftermath of any disaster that causes that disruption, whether it's a storm or a suicidal squirrel that knocks out a grid that causes a chain reaction across the nation. This country is energy dependent. And if you cannot get power back up and restore the fuel systems, communities cannot stabilize. And we, as a federal government, working with our states, are challenged just to hang on and keep it from becoming the next Katrina. Katrina was never about the nation's lack of resources. It was the lack of will to apply those resources. There was a New England state that prior to Hurricane Irene had planned for their worst case scenario. It was 50,000 customers without power. Irene was, for them, 500,000 customers without power. The other challenge is not planning for what we are capable of doing and not necessarily planning for the lack of activity or history. It's planning for what could happen and asking the hard questions beforehand. How do we as a nation, not the federal government, not state, not local, not private sector, not the citizens all independently, but how do we as a nation plan for those events that can and will happen, that will take all of us working as a team to resolve? We fail. You fail shareholders, you fail responsible parties that you work for, we fail as government, and then you run the risk of anarchy and lawlessness. That's the failure of government, to keep the public informed, to restore confidence, not necessarily fix everything overnight, but give people hope it's going to get better. And that's why it takes the full team. It's a national issue. It requires a national response built upon the foundation of our government, which is a federal government, which is built upon our states and locals with the federal government supporting it.
Thanks, sir.
Well, on that note actually, that's a note of optimism about what's made this country great. And this country has not been made great by a discrete set of federal officials. It's been made great by the kind of partnership that Craig's talking about, that we've experienced, that we've seen, is people stepping up to the plate in emergencies. Here's my takeaway. The secular trend here is we have a vast soft target. That's our infrastructure. We are an open country by nature, by constitution. And it's aging. You know, you look at the pictures of automobiles from the 1930s versus today, planes from the 30s versus today, typewriters from the 30s versus PCs today. They're utterly transformed. We still have a lot of anachronistic pole and can situations, including in my neighborhood. I still have to tell our local utility that we don't have power. We don't have that level of even sensory self-awareness. You add to that what's happening out there with the climate and the increasing problems that have been chronicled by the new National Climate Assessment, plus cyber, plus physical threats. So we've got an aging infrastructure and accelerating threats. And we've got to recognize the limits on our own power to mandate solutions. We're not going to, in short, mandate solutions. So it's going to take a smart combination of, frankly, a president who articulates a vision of where to take this energy economy and to have made it literally the centerpiece, the middle pillar of the Climate Action Plan in terms of adaptation to that climate change. And it's going to take working with all of you all out there, whether it's FERC or NERC or NARUC or the state regulators or NASCEO, everybody has got to understand. And because the stakes are actually that high, this is not a mythical thing. You know, I think the 2003 blackout cost $50 billion. We think Sandy was $65 billion of damages, and we've heard, you know, the $320 billion and so on. And this is real. These, as Craig just said, these centennial storms are happening like every year. And you don't look a day over 750, by the way. And so the question is, it's not what can we do, it's what can you do? Understanding what you all understand. And by the way, there are other ways other than a federally run mandatory system of emergency management, which will never exist. That's not our system. We just have to be intelligent about doing those things we can do to exercise our convening power, to do things where we can at the margins, whether it's through the Hurricane Sandy supplemental or the Recovery Act investments in smart grid sensors and PMUs and so forth, all of which have an ability to help both prevent and mitigate. And going in those directions, we will get better over time, but it's going to require constant vigilance, constant leadership, and frankly, constant exercises like the kind you're about to start in about 4 minutes. And so we shouldn't stop you from doing that. And I want to, again, end where I started by thanking everybody here for the incredible effort that you put in, not just here today, but every day. And I'm looking forward to hearing the results at 4 o'clock.
Deputy Secretary Poneman, Administrator Fugate, thank you very much for a very informative discussion. Thank you. So at this point, we will take a 20-minute break. I'll invite everyone back to the room at 10 minutes to the hour. I'll ask that the panelists return at 1:45 and step on up here, and we'll have tables arranged. I want to thank you very much. This concludes the online portion of the event. Thank you.